I wanted to take a moment to talk about our sponsor, Alt21, the foreign exchange and hedging platform that saves you time and money on cross-border transactions. A previous guest, Dan Gardner, spoke about forecasting and risk. One of his central points was, as he put it, the things we're doing now are so incredibly complex, to see even a little bit into the future takes an enormous amount of struggle, and even then we're going to make mistakes. As CEO of Newroll, predicting just 12 months out is hard. As we expand, variables and risks multiply. Anything I can do to take risk off the table is helpful. In the past, I've been blind to the risk of FX exposure in our budgeting. A small movement could eat into our investment budget and compromise our credibility when our forecasts are wrong. If you want to remove risk from your foreign exchanges without breaking the bank, head to alt21.com. That's alt21.com to find out more. Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader, bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Jenny Knott, non-executive director at the British Business Bank, the UK Development Bank, and SimplyHealth, 150-year-old mutual with a purpose to improve health outcomes for the many, and founder of FinTech Strategic Advisors Limited, a growth advisory firm for fintechs. Formerly, she was CEO of Standard Bank International and Next Optimization, a division of the Next Group, and NED at Gresham Tech, where she chaired the Remuneration Committee. Jenny is also a trustee at DAVS, a domestic violence charity, chair of Aquida, a senior leadership advisory firm, and Camco, a green energy fund. Jenny, I'd love to start with your journey into the boardroom, and particularly interested in the role your background played in that.
It was all very accidental, and even my early exposure to the boardroom was super accidental. It was as a consequence of being involved in structured products at one of my former employers, one of the former banks, and for tax reasons, had to put all of our special purpose vehicles into a jurisdiction. And we had so many of them that everybody got concerned that we weren't sufficiently robust. So they suddenly said, we need to have board meetings there. And then the quantity of the special purpose vehicles and the size of the balance sheets got so large. They said, we need really senior people there. So like the global head of global markets and the group chief risk officer. And then they said, somebody needs to make it all happen. And you go and make it all happen. And so suddenly I was in a boardroom with some really very capable people sitting in that boardroom every couple of months in Ireland at the K Club, because I moved it to the K Club in Ireland to make sure they all turned up, played a round of golf and did our board meetings. Just through osmosis, I learned what really good challenging looks like. I don't think when they started out, they thought they were going to be particularly useful, but then they realized that there were lots of clever people who had this quality time together, and suddenly they started having quality discussions. And so as a consequence, I just sat there and listened and learned what really effective challenge looks like, sounds in how they all challenged one another and interacted. And it actually was a really effective board. Internal board, which is unusual, but really effective because it was the different functions. It was first and second line having very high quality debates about the risk and the strategy and the business model and the consequences and resource allocation, so on. So, and I did that for quite a few years. And through that, I learned, I think, what good board papers look like, what good board challenge looks like. So it was an unintended opportunity, but certainly a really helpful one.
And so how did you go from sitting on those internal boards to sitting on independent boards?
So, that journey goes with your career. So I already was on a charity board at that time in my life because I trained as an accountant. Most boards want somebody with numbers experience. Lawyers and accountants always needed on boards. Everyone thinks, we need a lawyer, we need an accountant. I worked with Menca back in the 90s. And so being a trustee in a boardroom is also a really super learning opportunity. So I did that and saw what perhaps inefficient board meetings look like, as sometimes charities are. They're quite internally focused sometimes and slow to make decisions and slow follow up and have that sort of robustness of a really grown up external governance board ought to have. So I did charity boards. I've always done charity boards. And then through my executive career, as you get more senior inside an organization, you start to present in the boardroom. I wasn't one of those people that when I went into the boardroom to present in that sort of stage of my career that I was terrified of all the gods around the table because I spent so much time with lots of them. It was a a much less intimidating experience for me at that age than it would have been perhaps for some of my peers who hadn't had so much boardroom experience. So you start by presenting into the board, and then you get promoted into, usually your functional discipline, you become more senior and you start presenting more frequently, and then you become a board member. And then I was fortunate enough in my career to become a CEO. But even before that, as a CFO and COO, you usually have board director roles. And then it changes, because it's a very big change, from when you are an executive member of a board to when you're a non-executive member of a board. And that's why it's so important to do that sort of trustee type role, because then the difference between being an executive member of a board where you're 100% accountable for everything, as opposed to a trustee advisor or a non-exec, where really you're there partly as governance and oversight and to challenge, but also a bit of mentoring and guiding and supporting the executive. So they're very different roles between an executive board member and a non-executive board member.
You touched on your experience as an executive of boards. One of the questions I always like to ask CEOs in particular, is your board the highest return on time invested for you as a CEO in any given period? Curious to hear what your answer would have been to that question at the time.
I think we'd all love it to be. There are two challenges to it being so. One is oftentimes there is a lot of regulatory content that you have to cover in a board, which is not the most exciting, but has to be done. It's a bit frustrating, and that really then requires it to be super efficient, and it requires excellent board papers, excellent summaries, and an organizational culture where you can trust. Because an example I use quite a lot is SV Bank in that regard. So if you look at most, particularly regulated institutions, but others as well, you'll have these great big board decks. And if you don't trust the executive, not that we get paid just to sit there and trust, feel that they are untrustworthy, you've got to go and find the needle in the haystack yourself. And something like SV Bank, hidden in plain sight, was their interest rate risk sensitivity analysis. It was on about page 350 of the board deck, but it was there and it's in the public domain, right? It's published. And in there, it tells you for every 100 bps movement in interest rate, if there was an increase, they would lose X billion of P&L. So it doesn't take an idiot to work out that when interest rates are close to zero and they start going up, SV Bank's profit is going to be wiped out with a couple of small rate movements, 25, 50, 100 bits a time, and they're gone. It was there, but the C-suite, the executive suite didn't highlight it, and the NEDs didn't challenge it, and everybody ignored it and pretended that we were going to stay in a low interest rate environment forever. And so governance, excellent papers, excellent summaries, excellent presentations, but clearly not excellent trust and on either side, because that ought to have been raised by the executive and it ought to have been challenged by the non-executive. So governance really does matter, but it's only really a useful use of time if both sides are doing their jobs robustly. And clearly one could question whether they were or not. So the other side of the coin is that guide, that mentoring, guidance, strategic. A lot of that isn't actually done in the boardroom. I had some wonderful non-executives when I was a CEO and a CFO before that. And I would seek their guidance before I got into the boardroom. My view on boardroom effectiveness is 90% of the work is done outside of the boardroom. I ring up one of my non-execs and send them an email and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. We're thinking about going down this road. We're thinking about stopping or putting out of that country or building out this capability. What have you heard? What were your thoughts? What guidance could you give me? And you do all of that before you get into the boardroom. The boardroom is a bit of a stage. And if you think about a theatre production and the ratio of practice to the playtime, it's the same thing, right? It's 90% of the work is done outside of the stage, and then you just do your performance for a couple of hours. And that to me is really how most robust boards work. You query, you challenge. I'll send out draft papers when I was an executive. My non-execs would come back and say, hey, Jenny, I'm a bit uncomfortable with that. Could you help me understand? And then I'd explain and they'd say, great. So if I ask the question when we're in the board, perhaps you could share that in there and just make it a bit clearer, or just push back on me because I've got the wrong end of the stick or something. So we'd literally do the rehearsing before we went into the boardroom. So when you're exposed to brilliant NEDs like that, they're super helpful, super supportive. They give great guidance. They give you insights from their own careers or from their networks that I wouldn't have had access to at that time. And it can be a really powerful relationship, but you don't just do it at the board table in those 4 hours or 8 hours or however many of board meetings.
Who is that performance for? The way you said that, maybe I've misunderstood, that it sounds like a negative thing. The way I've always thought about high-performing boards is that you do the work before to make sure you've teed up the key issues, and then you bring the power of the cognitive diversity that you have in the room to explore and kick the tires on those key issues. And typically you set up options and different options, and you're exploring and testing the robustness of whatever recommendation you as a CEO is making against that cognitive diversity. But the way you talk there about performance, it sounded like it was almost a foregone conclusion, the outcome. So curious to hear if I understood that correctly, or...
Yeah, I'm possibly being a bit unkind, but let's say it's improvised performance. So you're going in very well rehearsed, but you are going to have a bit of an improvised performance. So yes, the collective cognitive diversity of thought, experience is really helpful in a board. But again, I would have done a lot of that work individually. And so before we went in there, I would have hopefully have had a few NEDs, and did have a few NEDs that were really well worth talking to in advance. And then on the day, it's not quite the perfect rehearsed performance, but everybody's had time to consider. I've debated with them all. I've got their inputs. And then collectively, the cognitive wisdom will be debated a bit. There are different agenda items, and there are different times in the year. So there are certain times of the year where you're very reflective and planning for the next 12 months. There are other times when you're actually got the airspace as a board and a strategy day or something where you're really being creative and thinking forward. But from a governance perspective, more often than not, it is quite a rehearsed performance. It's about going through the main decks, challenging the main performance indicators, the main management information, the comfort that we might have with our risk appetite and our thresholds, and what's red, amber and green, or our KPIs or our financial performance or our customer feedback. That governance bit, you'll get some challenges. Have you considered why haven't we gone cheaper, better, faster on this or whatever? But the governance piece is pretty well rehearsed. It's the second part where you're thinking forward or thinking around the business model or the talent planning or something like that, where the creative input is much more free-flowing and the challenge is much more intuitive.
So when you're talking about that performance, is that a performance for the benefit of the regulator and anyone coming back and looking in hindsight to be able to show you've done the work, you've done the governance reviews, challenges, etc. as a board, and that's just the way of capturing that? Is that how you think about it?
In my opinion, a big part of the governance is for the collective wisdom to have been seen to have done their effective challenging and review. And so it's a multitude of stakeholders. It could be regulators, it could be shareholders, it could be members, depending on the nature of the legal entity architecture. It's performance that you have to undertake. That's what governance is all about. Otherwise, why have non-execs?
We did have a past guest, Roger Martin, who challenged the whole value of boards, particularly in public companies, insofar as their monitoring role, saying, look, it's just not worth anything because a half-competent CEO who wants to pull the wool over the board's eyes will do so. So we're deluding ourselves when we think we can bring in this agent, the board, to monitor the self-interested executive, because ultimately who's then monitoring the monitor and rejecting the whole value of that regulatory board governance aspect?
What a CEO draws attention to can be masked. But as I said before, the answers are all in plain sight unless they're lying, right? In which case your auditors and internal audit, external audit, or somebody ought to pick that up. Otherwise, it's in the decks. They're just not flashing red, or they're not picking up the reds and ambers, and they're not talking to those. So yes, the CEO can choose how to structure the agenda and what to draw your attention to. But if I've got a board pack, one of the first things I do is navigate through the oranges and the reds in the pack. And they might not be orange and red. They might be naughty, and they're not making it clear where there's reds and oranges. So weaknesses, internal control, breaches of risk appetite, operation risk events, behind performance indicators, lack of achieving, they may not call them KPIs or OKRs or whatever, where they haven't had the client growth or they haven't had the sales that they anticipated or whatever it is. It's there unless they're lying. No non-exec's going to find lying out too quickly. But one would hope that the other second and third line assurance functions are able to do that in the external one. But when you start seeing the ambers and reds aren't being covered. So one of the things I teach people, and I teach them in the immersive board game, is look for the reds and ambers and see if they appear in the summaries. Because if they're not in the summaries, you need to start asking the CFO and the CEO and the CRO or whatever. And I don't mean the chief revenue officer, chief risk officer, lots of titles, but the C-suite in the room, why did you think it was appropriate not to bring our attention in the executive summary or your board summary to these reds and ambers? That's a great down in trust for me. That's a board that I would start questioning very seriously. So yes, they can mask, of course they can, but it's your job to check for that. And then you've got a big trust and culture issue if they're really not being honest about the reds and ambers in those packs.
I'd like to move on and talk about your approach to regulation and compliance as a financial services board member. In a previous episode of Enter the Boardroom, Paul Pester shared the heuristics he uses to get his head around the complexity of a bank and took me on a journey from thinking, my gosh, a bank's complex to actually it's relatively straightforward to get your head round. I'm really interested to hear what mental models you use to get your head round the business model of, say, British Business Bank and how you think about it as a non-executive director.
Well, so first of all, you need to understand the business model for any institution employing. What is it? What is your USP? What are you solving for? So we let's say the BBB, like most financial institutions, we sit in the middle between those that have the capital and those that want the capital. Right? It's that straightforward. And then what we're trying to do is work out what's the best use of the capital that's being gifted to us to distribute, and what are we seeking from doing that? Are we seeking returns? Are we seeking another way to describe the BBB is a policy bank? Right? We have what we call additionality. We have policy, so we can't just look for, let's say, the greatest commercial outcome, because we need to make sure that we're distributing it geographically, we're supporting challenged communities or whatever it is, or certain technologies. It may be life sciences or whatever. So what are you trying to solve for? What's your purpose? What's your mission? Is really critical. So you need to understand those pretty basic things before you even start worrying about, okay, so how do we make decisions? How do we do this? How do we work out what the key trade-offs? What are the business processes that are critical? What are the main 5 things we have to do every day as an institution to get up and survive and be in good health at the end of that day? Those, I don't think it matters what the company is. That's just good learning to understand. Why do you exist? Who are you solving for? And how are you going to stay relevant and strategic and sustainable?
And have you seen new people come onto boards where they have failed to do that for any reason?
The culture of every organization is different. So you need to understand that culture, what matters, where you are in the growth cycle or shrinking or the priorities. That's always different. So you have to invest a lot of time. Nothing more urgent than somebody coming into a boardroom and telling you how to run that board better than the CEO is currently doing, because they didn't read 3 board papers ago that you're precluded from doing it, or you did it and failed, or your competitor took you out or whatever. So it's not just about the now, it's also about the past. But that shouldn't preclude you from saying that just because you failed once means you failed again. If you don't have that historic context, if you haven't invested in reading backwards as well, then you can't say, I know that you tried and I understand it didn't work because of X, Y, and Z, but maybe we can try now because of A, B, and C. That kind of gives you credibility. Whereas if you just come in and say, oh, why haven't you done this? It's, well, they're not all idiots in there generally. So that's like irritating when people just haven't invested the time in going back as well as where we are today.
And in your experience, have all your boards always made that easy for you, or is that something that you proactively have had to do to ask them for all the past papers so that you could read them through? Because I see a mix of quality of induction and onboarding processes for new non-execs.
If you're a wizened board member, you will ask for it anyway. Yeah. And a healthy board would provide it. A healthy company secretary would provide that access. Today, it's much easier because there's generally most board meetings are supported by a technology tool, and there are hundreds out there, right? So all the past papers are on there and you get permission, you can read back. 15 years ago, it was literally saying, okay, I'm going to come in for the day. I'll go and sit with the company secretary and I'm going to whiz through past board packs. And he would literally sit down with you for files and go through it. And I'm sure most boards would still have that large file. printed out somewhere. But that's how it used to be. You would just sit there with the company secretary and say, could you explain this and could you explain that? But yeah, you do need to do that backwards investment as well.
I think that's one of the things that New Role has really helped with its sort of open hiring process, and we've done a lot with the financial service spaces, is connecting them with talented board members from outside of the financial services sector. One of the challenges that we sometimes see people wrestling with, those sort of strong candidates who are from outside the sector, is how do they get their heads around all of this regulation and compliance? You talked there about consumer duty, but that's just one of many different elements to it. And I think it can be incredibly intimidating for those from outside the sector. How do you think about that? And for someone listening to this who falls into that category, what advice would you offer them for how they can get comfortable with that?
Look, I'm not going to pretend it's not ridiculously specialist, right? So if you've never, but there's very little of our world where there is no governance, right? There's always going to be Companies Act. If you work in retail, you're still going to have health and safety and lots of government policy coming at you around minimum wages or whatever. So most people are used to the fact that you've got, if you're listed on the London Stock Exchange, you've got a whole host of rules and regs. They may be different. I think where it becomes slightly different in regulated financial institutions is that we have solvency or capital adequacy or these other things where you've got to worry about. Again, it's just a more complicated view of have I got enough capital to run my business robustly? The thing with regulation and complying with that regulation is there's always a logic to it that is quite simple. What's the purpose of all of the solvency, everything that the PRA do in regards to capital adequacy? And it's all very complicated with all the different reports and schedules and financial modelling and analysis. But the essence is, have I got enough capital and have I got enough liquidity to manage this business, not just today, but tomorrow, and not just in a great environment, but also in a not so great environment? And how broken does the environment have to be that I could fall over? That's all you're doing. Now, you can make that as complicated as you like with financial modelling, and we do a really good job of making it extremely complicated. But I would, and I get a lot of mocking by other people that I am not anti-regulation, because I'm not. When I was the CEO, I wasn't the one going, oh God, those buggers down there are trying to kill us all. Because the logic, the premise for most regulation is robust, is healthy, it's necessary. So, a regulator helps us make sure we try and do the right thing. So the logic behind most regulation is quite robust. Where we go wrong as an industry, both sometimes the regulator and sometimes the institutions themselves, is that we really cock it up on the execution. We can over-engineer it. We can try and legislate and regulate for every single viable possible outcome. And then it all gets a bit bloody complicated. But if you haven't grown up in FS the way I have, every single rule and reg has a logic. And it doesn't take that long to sit down. And there are lots of tools out there, lots of references where you can go and sit down and say, so what are we trying to do when we regulate these financial institutions? What are the PRA and the FCA trying to achieve in their conduct regulations? Well, you can put that in a code, like a livery company would have it in a code of conduct, right? A school would have it in a policy book. We can make 7,000 policies, but they're all over-engineering something. But the basis for them is always sound. It's just that we can make them extremely complicated. So I challenge people to say they don't know regulation or compliance. They do. We all do. There's no way you've survived in any institution, in any corporate, big or small, without having a plethora of regulation and legislation. It's just in FS, it's even more because it's a lot more financial and you've got this whole sort of much more robust lens about have I got enough resources?
You've worked with both large banks as well as FinTech startups. I'm curious to hear how your mindset differs, if it does, when navigating compliance and regulation.
It differs on everything between them. So what's I have a couple of shops with girlfriends as well. So we have a tea room, gift shop and a sustainable fashion clothes shop. The point being that when you're a smaller business, you don't have a department for everything. So when you're a bigger, larger corporate financial institution or other, there is a finance department, there's a legal team, there's a compliance team, there's an operations team. the subject matter experts in every single one of them. The smaller the business, the more risk you're all taking, and the more you've got to be a jack of all trades and pretty much a master of none. So between the Cancos and you mentioned David, he works in a business at a fund, a wealth manager that I support. I've been an advisor from since before they started, called Cadro. And they're a great new business. But they started off in the financial services space, getting approvals. They banked with SV Bank, drama after drama, bless them, but they built phenomenal technology and a phenomenal product, solving what clients really need to have solved for. They're solving something really useful. But the journey in that space, of a highly regulated space, dealing with client money, that's about as, high risk as it can get. And it's a team of 15, so including sales. That versus a great big institution of 150 years old, like SimplyHealth, where there's a department for everything. They are very different, and it depends on individuals. Some people can't bear that level of uncertainty and risk and detail, and having to be on top of everything. It's a different DNA from a very grown-up corporate where there's lots of policies. You have 6 months, you're going to have somebody brilliant to write it. There's a chief risk officer and a team of 30 or 100 or 500 behind them, versus the startup, which is, I've called you the COO. That means you're the master or mistress of everything that I'm not, or that I don't want to be. So between us, we're going to cobble together something, and we're going to just have to make our way through it and speak to some experts and use advisory panels. You tend to see that people had great advisory boards or panels that they can dip into and say, we were thinking about this. Is there an example? What haven't I thought about? What have I missed?
Where do people tend to go wrong in that startup environment where they are facing a regulator, in your experience?
Yeah, it's a great question, because in a funny sort of way, when I'm supporting that level of business, it's what makes them brilliant is their Achilles heels. There's always the two sides of that coin. So what makes them brilliant is that sense of validation and confidence that they know what to do and they're doing it, and they're the entrepreneur and they've got it this far and they're going to get it even greater. It's often their downfall because they're not very good at listening. And so they don't take input. And that's actually where they start making mistakes, is they think they know everything, or they think they know the right way. And it's getting that balance right between the confidence and the courage of your own convictions that has got you to that level of success, but learning to listen and take input. And I always encourage smaller businesses to try and get a pool of advisors. Be really deliberate about the skill set that they're searching for. So regulatory, compliance, legal, operational, financial, marketing, sales, a black book for capital raising, whatever it is. Be very deliberate about trying to build out that advisory pool. And whether you build a panel or a board, or whether you just put ad hoc contracts in place, the greater the pool of expertise that you can have access to. You don't always have to follow, but listen and make an educated decision rather than a vindicated self-righteous one. Then that's where I think smaller businesses tend to not scale robustly, whether they're regulated or not, but particularly if they're regulated.
I'd be curious to hear just how you think about that, Remco, and what are the key value levers that you're looking at as a member of the remuneration committee on a board?
Okay, cool. Well, let me just make sure we're clear about what we're talking about. There are two different things. Board incentivization is how you incentivize the board is covered by usually a governed nomco. So it sounds really awful, but the nominations committee, which is a very small subcommittee of the board, usually made up of the chair and the sort of senior independent and maybe one other. Whereas Remco, the remuneration committee, is the board subcommittee for looking at the remuneration of the company as a whole. And so when I'm chairing a Remco, I don't look at my own board directors' fees and motivations. That's governance. The two biggest lessons, let's put it that way. Number one is I don't think I've been being involved in a business in their Remco where it hasn't been overly engineered. People make Rem too complicated, scheme after scheme, or different option structures, or different this or different that. They can be so over-engineered. Every year there's a different set of KPIs, and it's not healthy. I mean, there's such a disconnect between the ability to understand how you earn your compensation, and every year it's different, and every year there are multiple schemes. So one of my sort of guidances is don't over-engineer your compensation structure. It's not helpful, number one. And number two is, if you really want an inclusive culture, like when I'm supporting founders and early stage businesses, I always say to them, no one's going to sell your business the way you do. No one's going to promote it and care about it the way you did. It's your baby. You founded it. I had a new alarm system put into my house, and the chap just happened to be talking about how he's scaling up. He's got to 15. And he said he was really struggling. He said, Jenny, I had the audacity to look you up, and I realized that I could actually get some free advice while I'm working here. One of the things I said to him in that scaling up conversation is, he said, I've lost 3 big contracts of clients because my sales guys are not pitching properly or not pricing properly or whatever. And I said to him, no one's going to care about your business the way you do unless you incentivize them and motivate them to do that. Even the best colleagues won't prioritize and go the extra mile that you would, but they could go a lot more than they currently do if they're motivated. So you have to recruit brilliantly in the first phase. So many people just get tied in with the recruitment process. But if you don't recruit the right people in the first phase, you're buggered. And secondly, if you don't incentivize those people appropriately, you're going to have a problem. And salaries are deemed an entitlement very quickly. No one gets excited, but even if they've got a great pay increase, after the first 2 pay packets, that's it. That's what they're entitled to. Bonuses often become that way as well. People often feel very entitled. They feel like it's part of their standard comp package, just split between variable and fixed. So it's not the incentive or the motivation that you would hope it would be. For me, humans need that carrot always, and they need to care. And I think incentivization is a way, it's more than just that. People always pay and conditions is that inclusivity piece. It's being empowered and heard and respected, having a sense of belonging or working with people, not just for them, and having a sense of purpose. All of that is a massive component. Those 6 or 7 factors are a critical component of a really inclusive culture. The pay is definitely part of it. For me, that's about sharing a dividend stream. If I earn, you earn, we all earn. It's a sort of John Lewis Waitrose model, or that kind of sense of mutual ownership. And I think that's really important for businesses to scale healthily and for organizations to get that sense of inclusivity and purpose and passion around what colleagues are doing. So most REMs will spend all their time talking about, have we achieved the KPIs to deliver on this formula? What were the hurdles? What were the this? What were the that? That's great, right? It's all very helpful. It's all very formulaic and it's all very, mathematical. But the reality is that really achieving your objective to make your colleagues care about the institution they work for and do the best thing for clients and for their colleagues and for the organization and for the cost base and for the growth opportunities? And do they create, or do they truly, when they duplicate, or where they think there's gaps, or what we could be doing better for our clients, or what clients we could be going after? They really need to care for that. And I think REM is a tool, but the bonus is not a brilliant way of achieving that.
Resonates a lot for me. The first point you made there around keeping it simple takes me back to my days in private equity, where I used to be heavily involved with a lot of the incentive structures that we put in place. We used to spend millions on these things. And then, of course, you'd get into the first bit of troubled water and they'd have to be all reset. And I remember there was one where we had to bring in a PhD. It was that we'd overcomplicated by that much. And over time, my real lesson was just keep it simple. And there's nothing better than just pure equity. And what always happens is one smart person in the room says, well, we should just have this thing for this scenario. And you've got to cut it off there and say, look, that is a thread you're pulling on. And the minute you give an inch, the floodgates open. And so keeping it simple, just pure, in my mind, the best structures are pure equity. Bonuses, I think, are valuable for the variable element if you need to cut costs quickly. But as you say, they quickly get accepted as a status quo. And the work of Dan Pink has been very influential for me on that actually it doesn't incentivize people. It's a sort of hygiene factor. I'm curious to hear, what's your kind of dream incentive structure? What would it look like? Is it an all equity structure with a bonus structure there that's just for variable in case you need to reduce costs, or would it look something different?
Equity, I think, is the primary driver, and I think different classes of equity, because ultimately, if you can't pay a dividend, then nobody should be getting a bonus, really. But the bonus culture isn't a terrible one. It's just that people become entitled to a bonus regardless of how the company is performed, and they only care about their performance, and they only care about their divisions or their product or their segment. And before you know it, you're caught up in this entire culture of everyone's entitled to a bonus, and nothing worse than you haven't achieved the providers of capital get no return, or you're incentivizing for short-term behaviors. I think sustainability, a sustainable business model, are you making a decision that's going to optimize your bonus next year, but in 5 years' time, it's going to cause serious problems for us. That's the problem with the bonus culture, is it's a very short cycle. It's like politics, isn't it? What's the biggest issue with our political architecture is that we don't incentivize our government administrations to make decisions for the long term. So, and I think bonus culture is very similar to that. And as you say, you start putting on that thread, and before you know it, it's a lot of haberdashery floating around.
One of the ideas that got surfaced in that board community forum discussion, which I really liked, was a reference to the work of actually one of our past podcast guests, Professor Alex Edmonds, who has written various papers, one of which advocates for the need for compensation, both a mixture of shares, but also debt. So that executives and board members are incentivized not just to create value, but also not to destroy it. How does that resonate with you? They would effectively be remunerated. You could be remunerated with shares, but you could also be remunerated with some sort of liquid debt in the company that would have some sort of tie-up restrictions, so that on that debt piece, you're not going to have any upside value in it. But if you completely tank the organization, you will destroy value. So that I think the idea being that it encourages people to give attention to a broader range of stakeholders, not just the equity holders.
I get it in that there's different mechanisms for one would consider for deferring income recognition or holding that back. It sounds quite as though we're into the realms of getting a little bit overly complicated. I think the key, what are you trying to solve for there? Like I always try and bring it back to simple language. What are we trying to solve for there? You're trying to make sure that your colleagues are thinking more than the next 12 months. You're trying to make sure that they think about the impact and the outcomes over and what's best for our clients and our strategic well-being for 24, 36, 60 and beyond months, right? So how do you get people to think about the long term or the medium term when they may not be there? And the danger is that when people think too much and too long, or they think they might be around, is they won't take risk decisions. And one of the reasons I always encourage early stage firms to think about their risk appetite is to think about, start understanding what are the key risks to their business and where they want to seek risk as much as they want to mitigate it. Because you'll hear that term, oh, they're so Teflon. And there's a truth to that. If you want to survive in the longer term, keep earning your bonuses, you shut up and just don't do anything that puts you above the parapet, because that taking of that risk is personal risk. It's your personal brand risk, and people aren't very embracing of doing that, which means they don't do courageous things for the longer term. For me, that's ridiculous. We need to address those sort of behaviors where we're all just sitting there doing what we did yesterday because it's easier and it's safer. I don't think it should be safe to do that. I think it should be incumbent on everybody to think a bit more creatively and progressive. And even if I take my shops, all the ladies in my shops, they all care. They'll say to me, have that unit's broken, or we need to do more of this, or this lady said this, it's this feedback. And those feedback loops are really critical, and they need to care to do that feedback loop. Or they'll say, have we considered doing this it might not break even for a couple of years, but it is the direction of travel or whatever. And I think that's what you need to solve for, is you need to solve for your colleagues caring about the outcomes for all of our stakeholders now and in the future. I don't think you do that through compensation alone. I don't think you do it through carrot alone. And I don't think you do it through stick alone. Corporate culture and how people feel valued, how they feel valued emotionally as well as financially, and how you reward. So yeah, a classic example. Reward new revenues, fresh revenues at a much higher percentage than you do franchise revenues. Just because I sold sweets yesterday, they all sold well, and we're going to start diversifying into sweet tree making. Great. The sweet trees, let's pay you 70% of that fresh revenue. I'll only pay you 10% for what I know the franchise is for yesterday. You can take that in banks, you can take it in any model. Give me something that's great for the long term, and I'll give you a higher percentage of equity or a more accelerated vesting or whatever. So to my mind, there are lots of things there when you're talking about longer. I'll pay you more money or a better promotion or give you a more exciting opportunity if you think about how I could save costs when you suggest something that's in someone else's department because you know you're duplicating it, or you know you're overlapping, or you know they're missing it, than just fixing your own business process. I expect you to fix your own business process, but you've looked up and you've looked around, you've said, I think they're doing the same thing as me. I think they're doing it. I'm missing this. I think we're using two different inputs of data. That's not helpful. people can do more, but you need to reward them for doing differently and doing something that's more collaborative and more strategic. So getting people to lift up their heads and look around, look forward, fresher revenues, different operational procedures, whatever it is, identifying internal control weaknesses, looking at client segments and saying, actually feeding back that client feedback, because we always ask our clients, don't always seem to listen, and we certainly don't tell them. So they don't know they've been heard, and we might disregard it. We didn't even tell them we considered it and then disregarded it because of X, Y, or Z. All of that good stuff, that's what needs rewarding. And that can be just sometimes just holding people out. A couple of hours was recently, I was in a hospital, not me personally, but I was in a hospital, and there was lots of accolades around this hospital. And one of the aides was showing her mum her big picture on the wall. She was actually proud of it. I'm not sure that I want my picture on the wall. Some people, those things matter, that being held out, being acknowledged. I always say to people when you're mentoring young talent, if you're a board, one of the things that the NEDs and the chairs can do brilliantly is they can take out the top talent for dinner. When I'm 56, at 56, someone's saying, Jenny, reward, you're going for dinner. It's like, great, thank you so much. But when you're 26 and someone's taking you to a posh restaurant to say thank you with your colleagues and you're part of a team of 10 that's been acknowledged as top talent or special or different or a thank you, that's actually, it matters at 26 or 28, right? It's a really exciting thing to have happen. It doesn't matter 56 in the same way.
Jenny, time has flown by, which means it's time for the lightning round, where I'm going to say a short statement and ask you for a quick response.
I need a swig of coffee for this one, Oliver. Now I'm wishing I'd read all the questions.
Boardroom behaviour that irritates you most?
Passive aggressive, where they pretend to agree and then they walk out not agreeing. Say, well, I know we said that, but let's really do this.
Favourite quote?
I've got two, sorry, but they're both really quick. One is my personal one, which is, you have one life. So I think that always reminds you have perspective. And the other one is shut up. Don't fill the void. Because that's really important, to shut up and let somebody else be uncomfortable and finish what they wanted to say, or they feel the silence.
Most significant professional insight?
Every business is made up of people. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. There are people at the end of that food chain somewhere. It's all about human beings somewhere.
What have you changed your mind on about boards over time?
What I've learned, I would say my biggest learning in the boardroom, which I learned from 30 years ago, so it's my secret success factor, is you do not have to dominate the boardroom, consume all the oxygen to prove to everybody how brilliant you are. So it goes back to that shut up point. I think the power of shutting up is really important. So I think the biggest learning in the boardroom is you can be brilliant by just saying one brilliant nugget in a meeting. You don't have to say 25 things.
When was the last time you got a significant judgment call wrong in the boardroom, and what did you learn?
Not that long ago. Never too old to learn. So what did I do? I trusted somebody that I ought not to have trusted, in terms of I didn't challenge. When they made a particular presentation, it was a CEO, and I thought, it doesn't feel right to me. I didn't challenge at the time, and I regretted it. So my learning was, when we're not here to trust. And sometimes you need to remind yourself of that.
How are you better today as a board member than when you started?
I think I made that classic mistake early in my career of believing that because I came up through the finance route, that my only value in the boardroom was on finance matters. And actually, if you're building a board, I don't want the finance people to just, someone who's got a finance background to only comment on finance matters, or the lawyer to only comment on legal matters. I want them to give me their insights and leverage their expertise on other matters as well. So don't think that you're there to comment only on your domain or on your domain of expertise at all. You're there because you've got other skills.
Jenny, thank you so much for taking the time. It's been fantastic to get your perspectives as both a CEO and a board member, and I know our listeners would have hugely enjoyed it. Thank you. Building a non-exec career is hard. For those starting out, boards can be opaque. For more experienced board members, it can be lonely and hard to stay match fit. Having placed almost 4,000 people on boards in the last 5 years, we know what success looks like. It requires time, energy, resilience, information, and connections. New Role Plus, our community of board peers, exists to give you these things, offering you wholesale support as you try to get board roles and become a standout NED. Find out more at newrole.com/boardroom. Newroll-Plus. That's newroll.com/Newroll-PLUS.